How can you save money while building software? Here's an allegory. Imagine the software that you're building is an animation. You start off with the concept. 5 vibes, you call it. These are just 5 faces that represent the different features that you want in the software. You like it. It's kind of simple, and the faces don't work together necessarily, but you appreciate the concept, so you extend it. You want them to flow together, so you add frames in between each of the faces. And this feels kind of flashy and maybe a bit more cohesive because you can see the transition between each of the faces. Something isn't necessarily the way that you want it, because some of the slides have backgrounds and some of them don't. So you try again. You extend it, you iterate over it, etc. And you come up with a version that's 403 frames long. And you like it. It has detail, it has transitions between the faces. You can kind of see where things are going and where things are coming from. It loops relatively well and you're satisfied. But there's a fundamental flaw with it, and I'll get to that in a second. First, let's look at what went into this. We can look at the time-lapse replay and kind of see where things came from. And that's cool. We like that. We want to use this eventually to show how much work went into this animation. We can also look at some of the statistics. Total strokes made, 12,000. Tracked time, 24 hours. Total file size, 840 megabytes. And you're satisfied. You say, this animation took work, I am proud of it, and I want to move forward with it. But there's a fundamental flaw with this. And that is that when I made this animation, before I even started, the color profile that I chose was CMYK. Right now, we're looking at the documentation for the software that I use to make these animations. The important thing is when we click on colors and then go to profiles, and we see RGB versus CMYK. This wouldn't necessarily be obvious because there's so much documentation. Knowing what stands out depends on your goals. But this says, digital art is usually created to suit either screens or printers, but not both. RGB is best for artwork created viewing on screens, and CMYK is the best option for artwork destined for print. And that's cool, sure. If you were to say this in a meeting, it wouldn't necessarily stand out. RGB for screens, CMYK for print. What does that do? Well, the important thing is that once you set your color profile to be RGB or CMYK, there's no way to change it. And they say if you're not sure, leave the color profiles on their default settings. The thing is, the canvas that I used is something that I used for stuff that I make print ready. So I was just copying CMYK into the animation before I actually did anything. Now that it is CMYK, I can't actually change it. I made a playlist where I go into more detail, but the main thing to notice is in the upper left-hand corner of this screen. This is the video about the clown animation debugging. The thing to notice is that the input.psd file is 650 megabytes, whereas the 5vibes.psd file is 114 megabytes. This is because PNG files don't support the CMYK color profile, and while I can convert it after I've done the animation using Photoshop, doing that increased the file size by about 5 times, which is pretty significant. I wrote a script using Python that would allow me to not need to use Photoshop to convert these from CMYK to RGB, but as you can see, the colors don't turn out the same. Additionally, looking at the PSD extracted folder, we can see the difference between the version that was exported using Photoshop and the version that was exported using Python. The Photoshop version is 10 times larger than the Python version. I wanted to verify these savings, so I made a simple test. I made a 403 frame animation that just has one color, a whole bunch of different things moving around. When I export this to a Photoshop document, the total file size is around 70 megabytes. But the main thing to note is that this doesn't increase 5 times because I'm not passing it through Photoshop. In addition, the file size doesn't get 10 times larger than it needs to be because it doesn't need to be converted to RGB at all. The colors stay the same because they're already in the form that they're going to need to be.